Welcome, Patreons, to part 2 of episode 14, How to Talk to Your Son About Fascism with Craig Johnson. I'm really grateful for your support. I really hope this project brings some joy and hope and utility to your works and days. Now, in part 1, I talked with Johnson about why fascist movements deliberately target boys and how online culture enables that recruitment. He talked about how fascism relies on young men shaped by Western masculinities, emphasis on power, dominance, and control. And he described the internet as a kind of political heat sink where humor, irony, and transgression disguise extremist ideas as jokes. So racist and sexist memes function there as social signals that draw kids into in-groups. And he stressed that when children bring this content to parents, it's calm curiosity and never anger, certainly not disgust. That's really important. So let's get right back into our discussion here, beginning with this question of how anti-fascism might become cool. Problem for young people to be aware of is that fascism pretends that it's cool. And so maybe we can get at this question of how would Mr. Rogers do on TikTok with the sort of, other direction, which is like, how does fascism present itself as being cool? How does it do that?
You have absolutely hit the nail on the head here. The problem is that fascism, I don't know if we get to say that it pretends that it's cool anymore. I think it is a version of what is cool.
Yeah, I've got some thoughts about that, but we can leave those, right? Like, yeah.
Fair, totally. By which I mean fascism is popular. It is a popular ideology.
Sure.
Millions of people adhere to it. It has an aesthetic that appeals to people. It has a culture, it has a community that appeals to people and draws people in. It's a subculture like any other. This was true back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, right? Or even more so in the 20s. Lots of people all over the world were infatuated by Mussolini's fascist party because of its aesthetics, because of its speed, because of its power, because of its newness, because it was new. And I think that that's a lot of what people find appealing about fascism today, is that in most Western countries, there has not been a powerful fascist party for 50, 60, 70 years or more, if there ever was one. And so it seems innovative, it seems new, it's exciting to people. It's new ideas that they haven't encountered before that people haven't been telling them about. And that is one of the central problems with fascism. It appears to be new, it appears to be exciting, it appears to be transgressive. And a lot of young people are simply enjoy those things. They like those qualities in things. Frankly, for roughly the same reason that young people tend to be the people who adopt a new form of music or a new form of dress, right? Fascism is the youngest of the modern political ideologies of liberalism, conservatism, communism, etc. Fascism is the youngest one.
I wonder where, just sort of thinking as almost like as a behaviorist, where the die-off point of coolness is, right? Because you are right that there's an aesthetic attraction, there's an attraction to power, there's an attraction to this idea that, I'm going to overcome my humiliation, or that I'm going to have a purpose, or I'm going to have something to do. And then what I see over time is that most new aesthetically based or aesthetically rich movements tend to lose their coolness. They have to. And something beneath the coolness begins to reassert itself. And with fascism, it's going to be somebody's telling you what to do all the time. Somebody is telling you how to behave. And somebody's actually very anxious about whether or not you're going to follow the rules. And that's where things become uncool. Is that fair to sort of string it out that way?
I think that that's pretty accurate. Although the fact is that lots of young people do like and believe in and want order and discipline in their lives. Young people join the military, and there are some people who believe that the military is cool, and that's what the military is. It's an organization steeped in tradition that tells you what to do with your brain and your body at all moments of the day. However, when it comes to the typical young kid that fascism appeals to, that's not quite the same kid, right? A lot of the transgressive fascist young men out there right now are excited about it exactly because it's transgressive, because it's new, because it's exciting, because nobody's telling me what to do. If the movement becomes big and powerful, it may lose that edge. It may lose that allure. But in doing so, it might capture all the kids who do, in fact, just want somebody to tell them what to do. Those are different kids, but there's still a fair number of them.
And I suppose it might capture them for long enough to make a real difference. But I am thinking about, for instance, how in the heyday of the Hitler Youth, they were not universally admired amongst the young people of Germany, and in fact, they inspired a number of rebel movements, and one of them sort of gathered under the umbrella, sort of name or moniker of the Edelweiss Pirates, and they specifically, these are roving gangs of kids who are listening to American jazz, and they're wearing, the wild sort of, I guess, our version of vintage store clothes, and they're spending their time making fun of these kids marching around in lederhosen. They are rewriting their songs to make them dirty. They are eventually getting into things like sabotage, like slashing the tires of the bike couriers and, lighting storehouses on fire and doing some really dangerous stuff. But the basic premise of the pirates was that, the Hitler Youth are just really awful, uncool people, and we're not going to be part of that shit. So I'm wondering, is that just sort of do you see that as a demographic, just sort of phenomenon that's just going to happen? There's going to be a sector of the society that resists youth indoctrination, and it's always going to be that way? Or do you see it? I mean, what I'm thinking is that at a certain point, the conformity of, either the Hitler Youth or the MAGA movement, for example, is going to become uncomfortable for just too many young people.
I think that that's an interesting question. I would argue that the MAGA movement itself, that is primarily the purview of older folks, of middle-aged types, right?
Right.
And the young fascists, they might say MAGA in order to piss somebody off, right? Like in order to scare somebody or whatever. But what they identify with is something to the right of that. They identify with something scarier and more to the edge. As long as they can remain on that edge, on that bleeding edge, as long as they can actually piss off and scare MAGA Republicans, they might continue to have legs on this. So a perfect example here is a guy like Nick Fuentes, right? Nick Fuentes is a young fascist influencer, probably the most important fascist public face in the United States right now, I would argue. He has always been on the absolute fringe, on the absolute bleeding fringe of the Republican Party. He's associated with the party. He's associated with public figures. He has had lunch with Donald Trump. He has had meetings with members of Congress. They've talked at his talks and stuff, but he's not been embraced by the party.
So everything but getting a speaking spot at CPAC, really.
Exactly. Yes.
Right. Yeah. He's in the lobby outside.
He's in the lobby outside, but then they kick him out because he says actual Nazi propaganda stuff. But then a couple of the other more fascist adjacent Republicans then go across the street to his
show.
to his more fascist thing and show up and say like, hey, we secretly agree with you, right?
Right.
As long as they stay there, I think that they can remain quote unquote cool, right? I think that they can continue to have that cachet. If they start to take over the coalition, which is what their goal is, then they might cease to be cool, but they would also suddenly become fantastically more powerful. So I don't know if they'd care. The point is that right now, a lot of what they are trying to cash in on is their being cool, influential, transgressive, etc. If we can catch them now, while they're trying to get a bunch of kids, while they're still relying on that, that might be able to stop them in their tracks, really.
Well, this is perfect for my next question and thought, which is, I don't know whether this is my, Gen X age and my own status as a parent and caregiver, and me thinking about like what my 12-year-old thinks of these people, and that being like a really poor sample. But like when I look at Charlie Kirk, when I listen to Andrew Tate, together, when we listen to these guys, we are laughing. It is incredible to us. I mean, not laughing at their influence or at what they say, but, Nick Fuentes as well. These seem to be deeply unsettled, very anxious, very stuffed shirt type of people who, like, we wouldn't want to hang out with. And I'm just wondering, like, what are the easy ways? There have to be easy ways, I think, or easier ways to show a wide variety of young person that guys like this specifically are really not worth listening to. That actually their claims, their views, their encouragements come out of like really gross places that don't really align with anybody's, with most people's values.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. When we look at, say survey data about young people's opinions about Andrew Tate, most of them think this. Most of them think that he's kind of a loser. The thing is that it deeply appeals to a small but large subsection of young men, let's say 30%, 20%. How do you get to those kids? A lot of the ways that people like Andrew Tate or Nick Fuentes or somebody like that are being attacked on the left, as in like progressives, liberal people are trying to get them to look stupid or something. Unfortunately, a lot of this is by attacking them at the source of their claims to influence or power. So like, circulating images of Andrew Tate kind of looking like a schlub, when a lot of his appeal is that he's this big burly bro, I take a lot of umbrage with that, because I think it just sort of reinforces the idea that a person should be influential based upon their physical appearance or their physical prowess or however many sexy women they can sleep with.
So what you're saying is that the implied hypocrisy, like yes. the image that says, "Hey, look, you're not all that. You're like the rest of us." That actually doesn't read. What it does is it humiliates, and yes. that's not helpful in your view.
Yeah, and it also implies that like, well, yeah, like the problem isn't his fascism. The problem is his jawline or something like that. Which is simply wrong. The problem is his fascism. It encourages, and it also feeds exactly into the same kind of rhetoric that he has, telling young men, well, the problem is your jawline. That's why people aren't listening to you.
Right.
The problem is that you don't have a cleft chin or something like that, right? As opposed to coming at them and being like, well, this guy's a loser, like he's just like a failure. He's a failed boxer who then committed a series of heinous crimes. He's a terrible person, that is the sort of attack that I would prefer to be seeing. And there's a lot of that too.
I interviewed Josie Reisman, the author of these amazing books on, professional wrestling and the politics of kayfabe and neo-kayfabe, and her thought about the role of the media in the Trump age was to really be clear about picking out the stories like a dog on a bone that actually served to humiliate a particular leader in relation to their following, right? So if Ed McMahon, for example, can be, humiliated by a particular story that comes out from, a trial that he is subject to, or he's the respondent to, involving allegations of abuse, then that's actually really, really beneficial with regard to tainting his image with regard to his followers. And so, she was doing something, she was suggesting something as a journalist that I would tend to shy away from, which is to actually dig for dirt, not because you want to foreground dirt, but because you want to actually place a wedge between the person who you think has noxious influence and whoever is following them. You want to show that 30% that you're talking about, that Andrew Tate is a loser. Now, you're saying that the photograph of him, in prison sweats isn't going to do it, but I'm wondering if, the sort of full accounting of how humiliating his behavior actually is, if that's actually the core.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same trepidation, I have the same concern that you were expressing about this suggested strategy. I'm not a professional journalist, but I am an amateur propagandist.
Right.
And so I have.
So are we all. So are we all.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's what having a microphone and talking into it means. When it comes to those kinds of things, yeah, that's precisely the same concern that I have, is that, are we not just saying like, okay, well, all you need to do is find somebody who looks like Superman and is a Nazi, and then like, well, then what are we supposed to do?
Right.
Like, yeah, sure. Like, Trump does not embody the features and statuses and behaviors that his white supremacist, male supremacist positions would espouse, but neither did Adolf Hitler, and that didn't change anything.
Right.
And like, would we have preferred if Family Man and like 6 foot tall Reinhard Heydrich had been leading the Nazi Party? No, absolutely not.
Right.
We have to be careful about this. We cannot fight them on their terms, which is part of the delicate balance that we're talking about here, in terms of like combating them on their coolness, on their appeal.
Yeah.
That's the delicate question. You can't say like, well, you're not cool according to your own measurements, because that's capitulating to the claim that their measurements are measurements that people should be measured by, which we must disagree with. We must deny that at every opportunity.
Changing gears, and on an upswing here. Are you aware of any subcultures that you believe might have actually good, let's call it natural immunity to fascism? Like, for me, I think about the neurodiversity community, for example.
I mean, that's a good example. I don't think that anybody is completely 100% immune. My knee-jerk answer would be like, there are not a particularly large number of trans youth who are Nazis. There are not zero. There are
a few.
There are some, and it's confusing, unendingly confusing.
Right.
But the LGBTQ movement in general, I think, is relatively not immune, but defended from Nazi ideology, from fascist ideology. Feminism in general, especially because Nazis hate feminists. I wish that I could say that the organized left were immune to Nazi ideology, but it simply is not so. There is a relatively long tradition that remains sort of deeply scholarly confusing, of people moving from the extreme left to the extreme right, going all the way back to Mussolini himself.
Right.
But, in the United States, we also have people like Lyndon LaRouche,
right,
would be another perfect example of this. And those forms of radicalization get people sometimes, and sometimes they get the same people in a sort of confusing fashion.
What's the connection there? Is it that there's a sort of aesthetic and energetic and kind of vibes harmony between the way in which somebody would have prosecuted their left-wing position and the way in which they flip it around and they just apply it to something else? Are we really talking about kind of like a personality or a temperament or a psychological type who is into politics for reasons other than content, let's say, and so they can argue for the radical redistribution of wealth one year, and then they can flip on it, and if they can maintain the same kind of anger or passion or authority, they can argue the opposite side the next year.
Yeah, that is, I would say that is the $1 billion question when it comes to fascist scholarship. What is its relationship to this kind of transition, this kind of change? Because
right.
it's something that does happen, and that remains confusing to me as somebody who's trying to study fascism professionally and has been for 10 years. I would say that there are certainly probably personalist explanations, but the fact that this has happened to thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people, many of them extremely famous, across multiple different times and in multiple different places, that seems to me to mean that there's something more than just sort of like some sort of personalist susceptibility happening here. I think that one of the things there is that fascism has not always been the thing that it is today. Fascism used to be a very anti-capitalist, or at least like capitalist critical movement. And so if you were already a part of a movement that was critical of capitalism, like socialism or communism in the 20s and 30s, like the 1920s and 30s, then yeah, you might be radicalizable by the extreme right wing. Often, if there's a single word explanation for how a person goes from being a communist to being a Nazi, the answer is anti-Semitism. If you come to believe that the problem with capitalism is not capitalism, but instead who is supposedly in charge of capitalism, then that can just be an easy on-ramp.
Not being a fascist historian, let me phrase that again. Not being a historian of fascism.
Well, I do the same thing.
I wasn't really aware that this is a difficult problem in the discipline, but it does make sense to me. And I'm wondering if you think it has some sort of relationship to some of the ambivalence of online life for young people, in which certain forms of left-wing activism can actually, not only bounce people towards more reactionary views, but that we might see influencers themselves flip from one pathway to the opposite pathway, not necessarily because they have deep commitments to the content, but because they have learned a particular technology of audience capture, and they've figured out that if they keep the pitch of the emotionality at a certain level, that they're going to bring followers with them regardless of what they're actually talking about.
I think that there's something there. I think that to the extent that part of the appeal, and we've been talking about this throughout this whole session here, part of the appeal of fascism is simply its transgressiveness. And if part of the appeal of the left is its transgressiveness, for some people, the idea that you would walk into a business and tell them that they're stealing and that they don't own things, right? Like that's appealing to a certain kind of 12-year-old, right?
Right.
Yeah. Or, calling your parents a Nazi because they're making you go to bed, right? There is definitely a connection there, that what is transgressive is transgressive. What is opposed to the status quo is opposed to the status quo. And if you're the kind of person that appeals to, then there's definitely a connection there. When it comes to influencers, most of them aren't, like I said, dyed-in-the-wool believers, but there are some. A counterexample of a right-winger like Nick Fuentes would be somebody like Abigail Thorne, aka Philosophy Tube, on YouTube. Somebody who has been pushing progressive and leftist ideas for quite a long time. But for most influencers, when they talk about politics, it's because it is a way that they believe that they can get clicks, in the same way that they might think that they could get clicks by like showing you a clip of their friend touching some goop that they left as a prank. It's the same kind of just like bait as anything else.
Two more thoughts, two more questions. I wanted to turn, and this reflects on the conversation of transgression and coolness, but it's a little bit more difficult, but also I think necessary to look at, as a lot of young, potential anti-fascists are figuring out how they want to resist this particular historical tide, how they want to protest, how they want to speak out in public. There are statements, there are slogans that are very popular, that are very energizing. They can be thrilling to say for people. Sometimes they can galvanate, a particular protest event, but sometimes they might not be so easy to understand. They might not be easy to assess in terms of strategy. So I'm thinking about the transgressive and or strategic value of, slogans like "fuck the police." As somebody who is trying to understand how fascists operate to, capture young people, is there value in, a kind of muscular pushback through language that carries a strong political message? Or what are the implications and liabilities of being a young person yelling "fuck the police"?
Yeah, that is a very good question. The fact is that young people are typically, and they have been for hundreds of years, they tend to be more connected to more radical, transgressive, breaking the mold politics than most folks are. They simply are going to be saying slogans that older folks might find questionable or irritating or transgressive or upsetting. That's going to happen. If those slogans galvanize young people, good. Period. The end. That's my opinion. We on the left, we as progressives need to understand that that a movement is a movement. It is not a coherent unity. There are going to be people in the movement who say things that you might disagree with. As long as you do not believe that they are evil, then you should chill out. Is my earnest opinion. Is that organizing young people is good. We need young people in the movement. I say this as an increasingly approaching middle-aged person. That said, if you are a movement organizer, let's say that you have moved up from being one of the people who joins the chants at a protest and you're now one of the people who is making the chants or the people who are planning things. You're a propagandist. You have to think about this strategically. What is the purpose of this language? What is the purpose of this message? At what level am I pitching this, right? Am I talking to true believers already? Am I trying to galvanize them and bring energy to this experience so that they can deal with what's coming, whether that's the police confronting them illegally or fascists showing up and wanting political violence? You might need to bring some energy then, okay, cool. But if instead you're talking to people who you're trying to convince, then you need to think about how you can convince them. And screaming things that people disagree with at them is not a good way to convince them of things. Screaming things that people are scared of is not a good way to convince people of things. It's a really complicated question that if you're grappling with it, good news. This is a question that has been debated for about 250 years by political propagandists. So there's a lot of good stuff written about it, a lot of good direction, energy, places to look, things to check out.
Well, maybe I just want to lean into that part of your answer a little bit, because I think often questions around what happens during protests kind of get filtered into sort of a moralizing territory that is about how do we want to behave, or how do we want to be seen as, citizens, or, what will people think of this, particular behavior, but not in a strategic sense. It's like, will I be seen as a good person or as a disruptive person? Will I be seen as, somebody who's doing something noble or as something destructive. And so when we focus on strategy and the fact that, for a couple of centuries now, people have had long and tortured discussions about, each situation and which slogan meets the moment. I think I take a lot of comfort personally in the fact that I don't actually have to decide alone ever around, whether it's entirely the right thing to do to chant a particular slogan. Like, I'm always going to be talking about that with my comrades. I'm always going to be talking about that with my allies. I'm not alone with that question.
Absolutely. That is a thing that is probably the most important refrain when it comes to political operation and political work, is that you're not alone. You can't be alone. You cannot do this by yourself. If you're at a protest, you're there with the other folks there.
Yeah.
If you are bringing an entirely different energy from the rest of the folks at that protest, then you might ask yourself, is this the right place for that kind of energy?
Am I in the right place?
Yeah. Are these people who want to hear this, who want to experience this, is that going to drive them further away? Is that what I want? You're making strategic thoughts. You're making strategic conclusions here. We often see, for example, arguments about violence, about political violence. We see accusations that Antifa is violent, because it breaks windows or destroys an ATM or something like that, sets a fire.
Or simply pushes back against riot police.
Or simply pushes back, right? They might punch somebody who punched them.
Right.
Or try to defend people who are
getting punched,
trying to go to school, or trying to get out of indefinite illegal ICE detention or something like that, right? That is a huge, big, complicated conversation. But the point is that all tactics are just tactics. All rhetoric is rhetoric. You have to consider its purpose. What is it useful to say now? What can move people? What can get me and the people that I love and care about the things that we want and need? And if you're not thinking about it in those terms, then I would question whether or not you're thinking strategically. You might just be thinking about performance.
Or what you particularly need in any given moment. Yeah. Which is going to be a factor. And it's going to be a part of what motivates other people and what joins you to other people, but it can't be the only thing. So speaking of strategy and, togetherness and cooperation and coalitions, you make a really strong argument in your book that multi-ethnic, multicultural movements and spaces are key to inoculating against fascism and stopping its spread. So why does that work? And how do you think Zoran Mamdani did it?
Yeah, stopping fascism requires millions and millions of people, frankly. Fascism in the United States is white supremacist. It is male supremacist. And so if you have a movement that is comprised of a great diversity of people, that is comprised of men, women, non-binary folks, trans people, cis people, people who are religious, people who are irreligious, all sorts of people, that movement is going to have a hard time if somebody wanted to infiltrate it and make it a fascist movement. That simply is not going to work. And when it comes to, if you want to say, what is a community that is that would be hard to organize in as a fascist, it would be one in which fascist lies about women, about minorities, about people of color, about people who aren't Christian, in which their lies would be just patently false. If you know a lot of Jewish people, then it would be somewhat harder and to consider them in an anti-Semitic light. It's not impossible, obviously. But the fact is that diverse, organized communities are hard to organize fascistically. Organized communities are easier to organize as a fascist. And this is why, for decades, the most ripe areas for fascist organizing in the United States were rural areas that were predominantly white, And also Orange County, the suburbs, right? Orange County is a particularly diverse place in the United States, but it is full of non-diverse enclaves, right? Neighborhoods, cul-de-sacs, schools, churches, clubs, teams, right? When those things are not integrated, are not diverse, in a community that is on paper diverse, like, by its census tract data, that is a perfect breeding ground for fascism. Diversity has to be real. It has to be actually experienced and human in order for it to function as an anti-fascist inoculant. A lot of times people think that community stops fascism, but it's not just community, right? We know from historical records that, in fact, communities that are more organized, that have more clubs and events and things like that, those communities are actually ones where it is relatively easier to organize fascism, simply because it's easier to organize anything.
Right.
But what stops fascism, what really hurts it, is when it's just harder. Like, it's just harder to tell somebody lies about someone if you know somebody like that.
Yeah.
It's just harder. If you know and care about and love someone who is trans or non-binary or Muslim or a feminist or Black or any of the other groups of people that fascists target in the United States especially, it just simply becomes harder to convince somebody, even a kid, of lies about those people.
Craig Johnso, thank you so much for being with us today. And I really appreciate your book. And I hope you keep writing on it and keep doing your own podcast as well. 15 Minutes of Fascism, right?
15 Minutes of Fascism, spelled out, all one word, wherever you want to get your fascist podcast, wherever good podcasts are sold.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks so much for having me on. It was lovely talking.
Okay, everybody. So make sure you check out Craig Johnson's book in the show notes. I'll put a link to his podcast in there as well. I have a little coda here that follows up on my opening remarks from part 1 about preparing to discuss the murder of Renee Nicole Good with our kids. And I want to broaden that out to geopolitics, because days before Good was murdered, the Trump regime murdered between 40 and 80 people in the process of kidnapping Nicolas Maduro from Caracas. This was another news story that came up in conversation. The 13-year-old is a solid critical thinker, and I'm really proud of him. Being young, however, also means that he's just not used to blatant contradictions that we learn to either navigate or to suppress within ourselves. There's still a very earnest shock of how can this be happening? Now, specifically, he's fascinated by the spectacle of Erica Kirk. So his other question that morning was, how is she going to justify the violence of her dear leader after her husband was murdered? Like, the guy that she's propping up is just invading other countries now. And so that was his question. Now, going on pure intuition, my guess is that with questions like these, it's both honest and stress relieving in that kind of long view sort of way to be able to convey two things at the same time, which is fascist violence is pretty much always like this. And if no one in charge is sane or kind or courageous enough to stand up, then we have to do that for each other, and we have to do that for as many others as possible. Now, to say that fascist violence is pretty much always like this doesn't diminish anything. It doesn't diminish the murder and mayhem. What it does, I think, is it spotlights an event like the attack on Caracas as a crest in a long rolling wave of imperial violence against the global south. It's a flashpoint, a symptom of ongoing theft through power. Now, the fact that it's spectacular shouldn't obscure the 1,000 quieter but completely normalized forms of this stuff that undergirds the entire system. Back during Trump 1.0, there was this liberal resistance saying, don't normalize him. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's a slogan that can be good for people's vigilance, especially if they have been politically disengaged. And of course, it's not normal to kidnap foreign presidents. But I also think there's a hidden vulnerability to that as a mantra, especially in relation to talking with tweens and teens. Because when you say don't normalize him, it makes it sound like Trump is some sort of mistake, an aberration, someone to burn yourself out with outrage on. But I think the truth of the matter gives more safety, that the normal behaviors of the powerful under capitalism are predictable. They're not hard to understand. You should know what to expect. So maybe don't normalize Trump, but absolutely normalize the understanding of how empire works. So back to the 13-year-old, the question was, this is as the smoke is rising over Caracas, how are they going to justify this? What are they going to say? And so I said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but I think this is pretty accurate. I said, well, he'll do a press conference and he'll talk about how great the US's military prowess is. And he'll also make up a bunch of lies about Venezuela and about history and about, claiming ownership over Venezuela's resources. But he won't really justify anything or mention that he just killed people in Caracas. If he faces any questions about those things, he'll just sort of deflect. Because he doesn't have to justify it, really, does he? That's pretty much what fascism is about. Fascism is about not needing a reason to exercise power. That's kind of how it works. The thing that I want to do is to spare him too much time in that liberal habit of expecting a reason, in the belief that fascists can be negotiated with or deterred or shamed by reason. The reason that you want a reason is so that you can argue with the person to show them that it's false. But this is a waste of time when the fascist is pointing a taser at you and then a missile at someone on the other side of the world. What I am clear on is that less time spent in shock and outrage that there are no adults among the powerful means more time and space perhaps to become sober adults who are free to be better. And that starts with seeing things clearly. I don't think there's any avoiding the shock and outrage. I think there's real value, however, in thinking carefully about how to reflect and guide it. Take care of each other, everyone.